We'd been stationed in Ireland and England for some time, about 6 months before, as the English say, the balloon went up. And 3 or 4 weeks before D-Day, we were sent into a staging area, which was sealed off. We were in a double barbed wire enclosure, which only a few people with necessity could get in or out. And I think most of us were anxious. These, of course, are all volunteer units. They had volunteered to go someplace first, and they were ready to go.
I commanded E Company in the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Elite, all volunteer, highly motivated, physically fit, proud troops.
The entire training regimen of the Airborne all contributed to the notion that all the soldiers held dear, that they were in fact very special troops. They were very highly trained, they were very physically fit, they were being asked to do something that other soldiers were not asked to do, that is, exit an aircraft while in flight, and all of the leaders contributed to this. They wanted the men to have this very strong sense of esprit and camaraderie because they knew those bonds were going to be tested once they got into combat.
I remember before we went into Normandy, General Gavin stood on the hood of a Jeep and he says, you look to your right and look to your left because 2 out of 3 of you may not come back. He says, but you're expendable, but you have a job to do, and I expect you to do it. And by the time he got through talking to you, you were ready to go to hell and back. But that was Gavin. They just admired him, idolized him.
The officers and non-coms were called together, and we were advised at that time that the invasion was scheduled for the next morning, the 5th of June. And after we were told where we were going, a messenger came in, postponed for 24 hours. But then the next day we came back and we got the details. Then we went out to the plains where all of our equipment was, and we loaded up with our regular combat gear. We must have had a good 120 to 40 or 50 pounds of extra equipment on us. But of course, a lot of that was the parachute, which was handy to have in as much as we were going to jump out of the airplane.
Allied Command had decided that the paratroopers' job was going to be secure the backside, the exits from Utah Beach, and concentrate them in the area of St. Mary-Église. Their mission there would be to hold off the Germans from counterattacking Utah Beach and then to open those doors when the invasion force eventually got off the beach. Because of the bad drops in Sicily, the leadership of the division decided we need a better way to get the soldiers to the right drop zone. What they decided on was to start something called the Pathfinders. They would take the best air crews, they would take soldiers who were volunteers and were very highly trained, especially in land navigation and map reading, and send them in 30 minutes ahead of everybody else to mark the right drop zones with both beacons and electronic signals that would then the other aircraft could home in on to make sure that the following waves were dropped on the right drop zone. There were 3 major drop zones, one for each of the parachute infantry regiments. The job of the Troop Carrier Command was to drop their paratroopers into the right drop zones, but they met challenges almost immediately.
It was about 2 o'clock in the morning when we hit landfall. We knew when we hit landfall, it wasn't going to be very long until we got the green light to jump. There was a low cloud formation, sometimes obscured both the land and the formation that we were flying in.
When we'd come to a break in the clouds, quite often I could look out of the door being open, of course, and I'd see other aircraft going possibly in other directions, which gave me the feeling that things weren't going exactly according to plan.
When the people on the ground put up their signal, it came in on a blip, and he flew down he went to the right and flew down the blip, and so we dropped right on the target. only the lead plane of 9 had that control, so there were other planes flying all over. The Germans had searchlights up, so the planes that were flying there were silhouetted so that the German anti-aircraft had good targets. At one time, I saw 4 planes going down.
The plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire, and the engine on the right side was knocked out. I was number 2 man in the stick, and I was able to get to the door first. And I crawled to the door, intending just to crawl on out, but when I got to the door, we were down at treetop level, much too low to drop. But I wanted to let the jump master know at least that we were gaining altitude. And when I called his name, he jumped. Well, realizing that I had triggered his premature jump, I went out too. And going out the door, I realized that the rest of the stick was going to follow me. So I had just compounded a small problem. But anyway, we landed safely.
We thought that we were going to be dropping in sort of meadowlands. I personally was standing in the door from the time we hit landfall until we got to the drop zone area. We were flying at a very low level, and I went out and got about 1 full oscillation after opening of my parachute, and I hit the water and went under.
The Germans had closed some floodgates along the Douve River, and this backed up water along both the Douve and the Mer de Ray and flooded a plain there that is often flooded with the spring rains. What they didn't notice, and this was a significant failure of Allied intelligence, was that the entire area of the Mer de Ray River had been flooded. More than 30 paratroopers were drowned with all the heavy equipment. But it also had the effect of dividing the 82nd Airborne Division. A number of paratroopers were on the west side of the river, and a number were on the east side of the river, out of supporting range of one another. So it really played havoc with the paratroopers' plans.
The assembly plans that we had went out the window when we dropped in the swamp, because it was then, how do I get out of the swamp, and how do I get to a place where that I can recognize? And the railroad embankment was that place. And of course, that railroad was loaded up with paratroopers in the dark after the drop at about 2:30 in the morning.
The way it happened, everyone was so scattered out and spread out. I, for example, was a long way from where I was supposed to be. And so we started, like Napoleon, for the sound of the guns.